An all-too-familiar story. Arab terrorists seized an American airliner. It ended today in a scene of smoke, screams, and gunfire. The hijackers shooting wildly, passengers scrambling for their lives. Not all of them made it. Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. The latest from the airport in Karachi, Pakistan. The Reuters news agency now says at least 17 people are confirmed killed. They include 2 of the hijackers. Most of them died in the chaotic gun battle that ended the hijacking of Pan Am Flight 73. Many more people, at least 65, were wounded by gunfire and rushed to hospitals. The kidnappers had held at least 350 hostages, including more than 40 Americans aboard the plane. They killed 1 American in the early stages of the siege. The end came suddenly. CBS News correspondent John Sheehan in Pakistan tells us what happened.
Pakistani commandos were preparing to storm the hijacked 747, but according to eyewitnesses, were not yet in position when suddenly all the floodlights around the plane went out. The air conditioning inside the plane was also cut off.
The civil aviation people might have known the quantity of supply of fuel inside the aircraft, and they might have calculated when it's going to run out.
The hijackers apparently panicked. Survivors say the terrorists ran screaming through the cabins, forcing passengers out of their seats and herding them to the center of the plane. Standing between the terrified hostages and the cockpit, the hijackers began throwing hand grenades and firing into the helpless people huddled together. Wounded and dead fell in the aisles and between the rows of seats.
The only person I saw injured was my friend's wife. They were sitting right next to me, and she had blood all over her chest.
Hearing the explosions and gunfire, the commandos stormed into the aircraft, firing their weapons. Pakistani officials say 2 of the terrorists were killed in the plane and 2 wounded and captured. A 5th man, suspected of being a hijacker, is unconscious and has not been positively identified. The terrorists had told their hostages that they belonged to a group called the Palestinian Commandos. The wounded have been taken to several Karachi hospitals. In one emergency ward, doctors treated a wounded hijacker and said he will survive. The woman passenger in the next bed died. John Sheehan, CBS News, Karachi.
From beginning to end, it was 17 hours of terror at the airport. Here is what happened. The 4 gunmen seized the Pan Am plane late Thursday night U.S. time, Friday morning in Pakistan. The aircraft had arrived in Karachi from Bombay, India. It was en route to New York.
The failure here was the failure of the airport security system. The airport perimeter was penetrated by these terrorists in a very clever way at a very convenient time.
The hijackers were dressed as airport security guards. They were armed with grenades and machine guns. While passengers were boarding, the hijackers ran up steps of the plane. They fired shots. Hundreds of people had already boarded. Many more fled when they saw what was happening. At this point, a cabin attendant alerted the crew in the cockpit. The cockpit crew took action that a Pan Am official later described as, quote, the best and quickest way to immobilize an aircraft. The Pan Am crew got out through their own special escape hatch in the cockpit roof.
And we saw a crew member jumping out of the plane window, and we saw him catching hold of a rope.
2 baggage handlers, said to be Kuwaitis, were wounded in the shooting at the time of the takeover. Later, the hijackers shot and fatally wounded a passenger. He was Rajesh Kunar, a naturalized American citizen of Indian heritage who lived in California. They threw him onto the tarmac. He died in a nearby hospital. A Pakistani official talked to one of the hijackers, identified only as Mustafa. He quoted him as saying he was sorry about killing the American.
What they said was that we have friends in Cyprus who are imprisoned. We just want to go to Cyprus to demand that those people who are our friends be released.
The hijackers demanded a crew to fly to Cyprus. They set a deadline of 11 p.m. at 2 p.m. New York time. But the deadline had not even been reached when suddenly the lights of the aircraft went out. The hijackers started shooting aboard the plane. This afternoon, I talked by telephone from New York to 2 of the lucky ones, 2 American survivors in Karachi.
It was about 9:15 or 9:20. The power went off on the airplane, and I slid myself down, almost in a fetal position, and stayed there. I was pretending that I was sliding down to go to sleep. And then, unfortunately, we did have gunfire break out.
And at about that time, why, they apparently released some hand grenades and started firing with machine guns at the same time. And the man next to me leaped over me, grabbed the lever to activate the automatic opening, and the door opened and the slide went out, and we hit the ground and started running.
Who are the hijack killers? What did they want? And what was the U.S. prepared to do to stop them? CBS News Pentagon correspondent David Martin has been investigating this.
The U.S. strategy was to keep the plane on the ground, shooting the tires out if necessary until the Delta counter-terrorist force could move into position. But when the shooting started, Delta was still hours away. The Pakistani commandos who stormed the plane were trained by the British SAS, one of the world's best counter-terrorist teams. But a former member of SAS, who himself stormed a hijacked airliner, warned that a 747 jumbo jet is a tough target.
There's no guarantee, no matter which entry you go in, that you're going to be anywhere near the terrorists. And it gives the terrorists an opportunity to take action against the hostages before you can close with him and do something about him.
However, U.S. officials say the hijackers were at a critical disadvantage. Unable to work the plane's radio, they were forced to communicate by bullhorn, cut off from all outside sources of information. The hijackers identified themselves as members of the Arab Liberation Organization, a group U.S. experts had not heard of before. U.S. officials speculated that the hijacking might have been timed to coincide with the appearance of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi at a conference of non-aligned nations, but conceded there is no proof of a Libyan connection.
We have no information right now about any involvement of Libya or any other country.
The hijackers were demanding to be flown to the Mediterranean island of Cyprus, and although the Pentagon ordered the aircraft carrier Forrestal to get underway from Naples, U.S. officials believed the Cyprus demand was a trick. These officials did not believe the hijackers would be so stupid as to go to Cyprus, where American commandos had been spotted during previous terrorist incidents, like the hijacking of TWA Flight 847. Officials believed that once aloft, the hijackers would order the plane flown to Beirut, Tehran, or Tripoli, where U.S. forces could not get at it.
Although U.S. military forces did not get to the scene of the crime in time, the Reagan administration is now dispatching a team of investigators, including FBI agents, to help the Pakistanis pick up the pieces at what was supposed to be one of the most secure airports in the world. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
At mid-morning on his ranch near Santa Barbara, President Reagan took his second call of the day from National Security Advisor Poindexter, who passed on reports of shooting at the Karachi airport. Despite the news, the President and First Lady took off shortly thereafter on their daily horseback ride along the mountainous ranch trails. About 45 minutes later, Mr. Reagan dismounted to take a call reporting that the incident was over. Then he continued on his ride. White House spokesman Larry Speaks deplored the hijacking and praised the Pakistanis.
The government of Pakistan acted boldly and decisively to bring this nightmare to an end. We can think of no punishment too severe for the criminals responsible.
For the last couple of weeks, the administration has insisted that it had hard evidence that Libyan leader Gaddafi was preparing new terrorist attacks against the U.S. But officials here today admit that there's nothing to connect Gaddafi at this point, at least not yet, and they don't know who's responsible. They don't know if their prophecy has come true. Dan?
Thank you, Bill. Word now that Defense Secretary Weinberger has ordered at least one U.S. medical evacuation plane to fly to Pakistan to bring back some of the wounded. Still to come on tonight's edition of the CBS Evening News, the terror for the families waiting here at home, and the U.S. puts a military payload in space to test the latest Star Wars technology. Long and desperate and painful hours. That was how this day crept by for families of hostages aboard the hijacked Pan American jumbo jet in Pakistan. CBS News correspondent David Dow reports the reaction of American families faced with terror a world away.
The bad news came early, and the mourners followed to the home of Rajesh Kumar, the first fatality of the Pan Am hijacking. Just 29, returning from his parents' native India, and, said a spokesman, proud of his new U.S. citizenship.
Everybody's devastated. They've just taken away an innocent person, never done anything wrong in his life.
Four gunmen holding that hijacked aircraft in Karachi.
For most other families with loved ones aboard, there was uncertainty. The DeVay family of Taft, California, could only watch and wait for news of daughters Gayatri, 13, and Gargi, 10.
The wounded include many women and children. There was no immediate word on any deaths.
This has got to be terribly frustrating for you. Yeah.
Yes.
It's very hard.
Tonight, Mr. Dave received word that both daughters were injured, one seriously. In Downey, California, another unrelated Dave couple awaited news of son Dweejel, who was on his way home after more than 3 months with relatives in India.
Usually it's, children and women are safe, but now whatever we have just heard on the news, I'm really scared.
Late today, there was a call from airline officials in Bombay saying Dweejel was all right. But the Daves want further assurance. By this afternoon, phone calls were bringing relief to some other families.
So he's not hurt or anything like that?
In Houston, M.J. Ruddy awaiting word of his nephew.
Pan Am just called the child is safe, he's returning back.
I'm so glad. I thank God.
And in Ohio, to Soraya Ahmed.
My husband is fine. He has no problem. My sister, my nephew, and my niece are injured because they had to jump the plane.
Injured, but they will recover. In the context, good news. David Dow, CBS News, Los Angeles.
A year ago, June, the face of murderous hijack terror and the face of bravery on a tarmac in Beirut. Here, Captain John Testrake was the pilot of TWA Flight 847. That hijack nightmare lasted 17 days. I talked to Captain Testrake earlier today at his home in Missouri and asked him about the tactics used to end this latest hijack siege.
As it turned out, it would appear to me that it was handled exactly correctly, because we've since been told that the people on the ground at Cyprus were going to deny landing permission for the aircraft if it ever had got into the air. I can speak from experience that it's a very uncomfortable position for an aircraft commander to be in flight with a plane load of passengers and to be refused permission to land. And so it's better, really, that it worked out this way. A good many people were hurt here. However, had they flown, I'm afraid they would have all been killed.
But on your plane, as you point out, Captain, every passenger but one survived. Is there a lesson here on the handling of hijackings, or is that too much to draw?
No, I'd caution very much against drawing any parallels. In my case, I think it was better that we accommodate the hijackers, and to the extent that we did, and to play it out through the role of negotiations.
The crew in Karachi, as you know, this Pan Am crew, the cockpit crew, left through their own escape hatch. One man's personal opinion. They did the right thing?
Yes, sir. The events seem to have vindicated their decision completely.
Veteran airline pilot John Testrake, veteran of the hijack siege of TWA Flight 847 in Beirut in June 1985. We'll have other news in a moment, and a little later in the broadcast, views of today's hijacking by Bill Moyers and the terror offensive against U.S. citizens reported by Bob Schieffer. There's a report tonight that a Pan American stewardess aboard the hijacked jumbo jet took a risk and bravely concealed some American passports from the hijackers. She was concerned that Americans would be particularly at risk. Once again, we Americans find ourselves asking, what can we do about these outrages? That is the subject of tonight's commentary by CBS News correspondent Bill Moyers. Bill?
Dan, the first response is human. Even journalists feel it. If the Libyans are responsible, go in and get them. Let fly the Delta Force. Turn loose the Rangers. Unleash the jets. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But then the second thoughts. Isn't that what we did the last time? We got Gaddafi in his lair, struck his own family as they slept. Vengeance was ours, and it felt very good. But wait a minute. Did we get what we really wanted? Most of all, we yearned for an end to the terrorist acts, the murder of Americans at random. Now we know we still don't have it. There are thousands, tens of thousands of fanatical young men roaming the Middle East, eager to kill Americans. 2, 4, 6, a dozen go down, others rise to replace them. They respond to our response to their response. An eye for an eye for an eye for an eye, until finally hatred is blind. Who are these young men? What's happening out there to rouse their fury? Why do they stand in line to kill and be killed? I've traveled in that part of the world off and on for a quarter of a century. Once I moved easily in their midst. The worst they said about us is that we were bumbling but good-hearted, rich but generous, naive but nice. Now America is Satan, and any one of us a beast to be cornered and quartered. How is it we've been transformed into the enemy? Not in Washington, nor in the media, nor among the public at large are there serious efforts to find out why. So we're dangerously close to settling, as the besieged tend always to settle, for the mentality of a state of mind, of war, not knowing how and why it started or what continues to feed it. It is war of a sort, but no military action is likely to end it. Whatever the emotions just now, whoever did it this time, vengeance remains a salve, but no solution.
Secretary of State Schultz said today, and I quote, "American resolve, backed by our power, will rid the world of terrorism someday." But as today's events remind us, that hour is not at hand. CBS News correspondent Bob Schieffer looks at the limits of power and a terror that knows few constraints.
The airport in Rome just days after Christmas last year. A crippled U.S. airliner grounded on the tarmac of the airport in Athens this year. The wreckage of a nightclub in Berlin, gathering place for young American soldiers. The terrorist act that sent American planes on the bombing run over Libya. Now another wrenching reminder that despite their might, America and its allies still have no real answer for stopping terrorists. For most of us, such horrors are almost beyond comprehension. But for a growing group of Americans, those who have had to cope with terrorism firsthand, it is all too easy to comprehend. Lawrence Jenko, released in July after being held hostage for a year and a half in Beirut.
Even though there's terror and fear, there's a certain moment of acceptance of one's own dying.
Alan Conwell, a passenger on TWA's ill-fated Flight 847, one of 39 Americans held captive for 17 days.
I have to say that every time something like this happens, it does stir up the memories.
Viola Meskin, who was on the nightmare voyage of the hijacked cruise ship Aquile Laro.
You think about it even when something doesn't happen, but when it happens, it just makes it a little bit deeper into the bone and into the flesh.
There had been talk about whether the quiet summer meant that terrorism was finally beginning to run its course. But now it appears the signs of modern autumn are again upon us. The weather is beginning to break. The kids are back in school. The terrorists are back on the job. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, New York.
And that's the CBS Evening News for this Friday. We hope you'll be with us again on Monday. Dan Rather, courage. Good night.
Liftoff of Delta 180 and its SCI payload. The first programs are in, and the vehicle is starting to turn on its axis and arc over onto its flight azimuth. All of the attitude disturbances look very good. Engine chamber pressures are reported to be normal. The first group of...
It's tennis as it should be played. The women's final and the men's semis at the U.S. Open tomorrow on CBS Sports.
This is CBS.